So our friends over at Judicial Watch are announcing today that they have received 345 pages of records from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency under the umbrella of the Department of Defense regarding U.S. funding for Anthrax biolabs in Ukraine. Ever since the issue first exploded onto the scene earlier this year with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both sides have tried to utilize the allegations to their benefit. Just 2 weeks ago, at the end of October, Russia drafted a resolution to the United Nations Security Council asking for an investigation into the biolabs. The resolution would have required a 15-member commission to relate their findings to the Security Council by the end of this month and to set up a review conference in Geneva, Switzerland. However, last week the proposal was overwhelmingly rejected by the UN Security Council. So before we dive into some of these updates, I want to briefly touch on propaganda in general in order to make some of our conversations tonight make at least a little bit more sense. Because one argument that I find very interesting about the legacy of the Cold War is that the threat of nukes forced much of the fighting to be done through proxies, and especially by information manipulation, as a way to avoid nuclear Armageddon with backdooring aggression under plausible deniability. It was both a continuation and an escalation to the way modern war was being fought before this latest sword of Damocles, the threat of nuclear Armageddon, was raised above our collective heads. For example, with the First World War, Britain's War Propaganda Bureau, Wellington House, was unceasing in its push to demonize the Germans as being a new wave of barbaric Huns, coming to destroy Western Europe in a great Manichean fight between good and evil, when in reality it was a great power war which had more to do with the UK and France being unnerved by German belligerence as it came into its own with increased manufacturing and plans for a North Atlantic High Seas fleet. The plan was to drag America into the war to help the Allies through such propaganda by turning it into a moral crusade. By the end of it, when the British Empire had expanded at the cost of creating a gutted and resentful Germany that would come back to bite everyone, many Americans felt used in an imperial ploy for dominance over the European continent. We could also look to the British and American overthrow of the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 because he tried to nationalize his country's oil supply. At one point, the CIA bragged about how 4/5 of the information in Persian that Iranians heard over their radios or in the newspapers was actually being written by American spooks and then fed through local proxies to sway public opinion against their beloved Prime Minister. Eventually, the resentment that built up in Iran fomented into the Islamic fundamentalist revolution of 1979, created a giant terror state. This isn't to say that it's always wrong for great powers to use propaganda when necessary and to sometimes take a firm hand in international affairs. It just has to be done judiciously and wisely, two words our current statesmen have forgotten the definitions of. Because we all know the adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So since the Cold War, with much of the fighting being done through propaganda when it wasn't happening physically in, say, Vietnam or Afghanistan, that means we have to be very careful about what we believe to be true and to be accurate, because a lot of people are fighting for our minds now. Just think back to recent wars like the ones in Iraq or the Gulf War, whether it be weapons of mass destruction or babies being bayoneted in incubators. We were lied into war, at least at a superficial level, because if the foreign policy blob was honest about their real reasons or goals for wanting to go to war, they know the American people wouldn't support it. So they gave us fake moral crusades instead that end up unraveling and making more people distrustful of their government. This brings us to the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is one that is falsely being painted as a moral crusade, as a war between the free world and tyranny, between democracy and autocracy, when the reality is more to do with the foreign policy blob trying to create, consolidate, protect its unipolar moment on the world stage. So joining us now to discuss the new biolab findings is Chris Farrell, the Director of Investigations and Research at Judicial Watch. Thanks for being here tonight, Chris.
Sarah, you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to propaganda. The first casualty of war is the truth, and your opening commentary is right on the nose.
Well, I really do appreciate it, and I want to ask you, it looks like the U.S. was funding these biolabs in Ukraine in 2019, 2018, I believe, to the tune of $11 million, correct?
Yeah, and that's chump change, right? That's nickels and dimes compared to the $70 billion we're sending to Ukraine now. Look, this program, honchoed by Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, it's really a jobs program for former Soviet scientists, right? That's what the intention was. You have the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you have Ukraine breaking off to become its own country, its own sovereignty in '94. What do you do with all these labs and all these scientists hanging around who have very deadly toxins on their hands? Well, you co-opt them, right? So you create a program, you fund them, you let them do their experiments, but the idea is, since you're funding them, you're controlling them. That's the idea, except that then it becomes inconvenient and awkward when things like wars pop up or when the Russians knock out all the electricity in Ukraine. And guess what's needed to maintain those laboratories and the security of those pathogens in those labs? Electricity. So that there's lots of problems beyond just the headlines. But yes, anthrax in labs in Ukraine, true. Everyone's going to spin it the way they want to, but it was our effort to co-opt former Soviet-era lab programs and scientists and put them on our payroll.
And it's very interesting with some, I know the pages that you got over 345, but they were heavily redacted. I mean, that tells a lot right there. But
Yep.
from what you were able to determine, is there a lot of oversight about what's going on? Because I think a lot of people think back to, well, Wuhan with the SARS-CoV-2, you think about the gain of function research, and then we think, well, now we're looking at anthrax and biolabs. A lot of people kind of get nervous, especially over these last 2 years. Do we kind of know what the level of oversight has been about where the money exactly was going and how it exactly was being used in these labs?
All your suspicions are right on the nose. They are correct. There should be a lot of concern about it. Ukraine is an enormously corrupt country, has been for decades. On one of these, I forget what the source is, whether it's the United Nations or World Bank or some international organization has a corruption scale. And on their scale, Ukraine ranks below China and Cuba. Right? And so it is a very troubled country, and you've got very deadly pathogens in the hands of people who you hope that we've co-opted through payments and through a plan and a program that our Defense Department would manage and have oversight of, but don't count on it. And it's now a war zone. So there's very real, very genuine concerns that something other than the official certified plan for everything being under control and well managed and monitored is going on. It is a grave concern.
And not saying that what's being done in these labs is necessarily bioweapons to be released, but I think it just brings to mind that that history is never too far away from us. I know the Japanese, they used bioweapons actually against the Chinese in the 1930s. And we also know that smallpox, even though it's been eradicated right now from our globe, it does exist in samples in 2 places, at the CDC headquarters in Georgia and also at a lab in Russia. So, I mean, I think it's in the back of a lot of people's minds as well. And I know in the Judicial Watch press release toward the bottom, they have here talking about Hunter Biden. I have the New York Post reporting that Hunter Biden helped secure funds for a U.S. biolab contractor in Ukraine. So it makes people kind of concerned when you have someone like Hunter Biden, and we know his past history, kind of dabbling in this kind of world. Is it questions like that that you also still want answers to, perhaps with more documents that aren't as heavily redacted?
Absolutely. Look, I encourage your viewers to go to our webpage, judicialwatch.org. Go look at the documents for yourself. Don't take my word, don't take your word. Go read the documents for yourself and make up your mind. And when you see terminology that says such and such a name, the name's blacked out, and then it says anthrax program manager, what do you think that means? That means they have anthrax at the lab, and that person is managing the program at the lab. These are not leaps of logic or extraordinary, wishful thinking or dot connecting. Read the original Department of Defense documents for yourself and make up your own mind. You will be disturbed at a minimum and have many, many questions about what we were doing there, what we were financing, and then it goes to the larger question. If we were spending millions of dollars on a program like this, what are we doing now when we've sent, tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine? It's just, I'm an America First guy. I'm interested in our interests coming first. And when you look at all these foreign involvements and what we're doing and how we're spending money and what we're up to, it begs more questions and oversight. And that's one thing that we're not getting.
No, you're exactly right. And about one last minute here before I let you go. And actually, we get to talk to your wife next after the break, so that's going to be fun. Last minute here, is there any other developments or takeaways from this report Judicial Watch put out that I didn't get a chance to get to yet?
No, I mean, you've hit the highlights of it. Again, I encourage your viewers to go and read the original documents for yourself. Don't take my word for it. But when you go through and you see the amount of money that's spent, the government contractors that are involved in helping to manage the program, the different pathogens that they're handling in the laboratories, it's alarming. And then you do a little additional reading and you see that people that are responsible for the oversight, they say, well, we got to have electricity and we got to have the right biosafety people, working in those positions at those labs. Well, when you have a war going on and the Russians have their hearts set on knocking out electricity in Ukraine, and you have to imagine that some of the people in these labs have decided not to hang around, that maybe it's a good idea to go someplace else. Who's in charge? Who's running these labs? Do they have backup electricity? It's a real threat. People got concerned when the nuclear reactor in Ukraine came under scrutiny. You should be just as concerned about biolabs.
All great questions that you posed there, Chris. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.